In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the goals and history of special education, including, very importantly, IDEA. I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm having internet issues as I'm recording this, and so my captions hopefully will keep going, but because captions require the internet to record them, they might have some issues tonight. If that's an issue for you, please reach out, let me know, and we can work something out. So first, goals of special education. One of the goals of special ed, one of the reasons we have special ed, is for equality of opportunity. This is the belief that everyone, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of their challenges, regardless of their abilities, should all have the opportunity to be successful in school, to be successful in life, and to have the opportunity for full participation in a variety of contexts. And that's the second goal, full participation. Full participation means participation in the classroom. It means participation in extracurricular activities. It means participation in co-curricular activities. Now, full participation is the goal. It may not be possible for all students, but the goal is full participation. Independent living. One of the goals of special education is to transition students out of special education. If you're teaching high school, you will work with transition plans for your students once they reach age 14 now, I believe. I think that's one of the relatively recent changes in the law. That may vary from state to state, though. But the idea is to transition. What will they do next? And that transition plan can include post-high school training, but it also includes information on independent living. Now, independent living is probably not a significant issue for students with a learning disability. It might not be a significant issue for students who have a speech or language issue. But it might be a significant issue for students who have a developmental or cognitive disability, for students who have significant emotional disorders, and for students who have some types of autism. And related to this, economic self-sufficiency. People with exceptionalities are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed. They're more likely to require government or charitable assistance in their post-school lives. And as much as possible, we would like for people to be self-sufficient. That is a goal of special education. One thing I want to mention is the importance of people first or person first language. We know, of course, that exceptionalities don't define people. And so what people first language means is putting the person or the group that includes the person before the disability or exceptionality. So students with learning disabilities rather than learning disabled students. We would say Charlie has autism rather than Charlie is autistic. We would say Mary has diabetes rather than Mary is diabetic. The disability or the exceptionality or the disease, whatever it may be, does not define the individual. Now, some people might not like person first language who have an exceptionality. And that's okay. If they don't like it, then use the language that they prefer. I'm not going to go over most of this brief history. It's on the PowerPoint if you want to see it, about how special education developed in the United States over time. But I do want to talk about federal legislation. We're going to come back to legal issues later in the course. Just as a really brief introduction, the national requirement for special education started in 1975, the Education of All Handicapped Students Act. This basically said that schools were required to provide special education services for students, and they couldn't make parents pay for those services. In 1990, this law was pretty significantly revised and became known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And that law has been again revised since then several times, including in 2004. And the terminology has sometimes changed a little bit, but we still typically today just call it IDEA. And I'll talk in a minute what the big shift in 1990 was. IDEA has 6 principles. And these 6 principles also sort of tie into the goals of special education to an extent. Principle 1, zero reject. This means that schools cannot not accept students who have special needs. A public school has to teach whoever walks through their doors. We cannot say, oh no, we can't teach them because they have this or this or this disability. Evaluation has to be non-discriminatory. In other words, to get into special education and to remain in special education, the evaluations that are conducted have to be culturally fair and unbiased. I mentioned in the previous video briefly intelligence tests. Intelligence tests have a bad reputation among some educators because traditionally they were culturally biased. That is not true for modern intelligence tests. Non-discriminatory evaluation also means, for example, testing a student in their home language. Free and appropriate education, or FAPE, parents cannot be charged for special education. They cannot be charged for special services that are needed by the student. Now, if parents are charged in general in the district for things like a textbook rental fee, similar fees like that still can be charged, but it can't be more than would be charged for a student who is not in special education. Appropriate education has been the target of multiple lawsuits. Appropriate does not mean ideal. So it might be ideal for every student to have their own paraeducator. That is not required, however, to meet a student's needs. So appropriate education for the student's needs. Least restrictive environment. This means that as much as possible, a student with a special need should be educated with their peers who do not have those special needs, their regular education peers. This will vary from student to student, and related to this, schools are required to offer a continuum of services. In other words, they need to be prepared to offer services, consultation services when a student does not need direct services with his teacher. They need to have resource services when students might need just occasional services. They might need pull-out services when a student needs intensive services or more common services or whatever it may be. So the continuum of services. Due process, just as legally and other things, people have a right to due process. IDEA says that specifically applies to special education as well. What this means, among other things, is that if a parent wants their child to be in special education, but the school says they don't qualify, the parent can file a due process appeal, and that goes through a specific process. The opposite could also be true. Sometimes a school wants a kid to be in special ed and the parent does not. A school could also take this to mediation for due process. That they typically won't, but they theoretically could. In general, although some parents definitely don't want their students to receive services, in my experience, it's been more likely for a parent to want their child to get special education services even though they don't qualify than for a parent to refuse for their child to get special education services. But no matter what, a parent has to agree to it. If a parent does not agree to special education services, the school is not able to provide them. And that relates to parent and student participation. We will talk about IEPs, individual education programs, more later in the course. Those programs need to be designed with parent input and with, whenever possible, student input and participation. There's some other federal legislation that relates to education. I'm not going to go into most of these because they're things you've seen other places, but I do want to talk about on this slide these two. Section 504, you might have students who have 504 plans. A 504 plan is very similar to an IEP. Typically a 504 plan, which I know that the captions don't like, that would be 504. A 504 plan is a plan where a student doesn't need specialized education. In other words, their needs don't affect their learning in the classroom. Rather, it's something that is often something that's more transitory. Like a 504 plan might be for a student who has a a disease, but it's not a chronic disease. It is not ongoing over a long time, but it might be something that happens for for months to a year. Some schools I know have done 504 plans for students who are pregnant. I'm not sure how common that is anymore. Sometimes a school will do a 504 plan for a student who doesn't qualify for, say, a learning disability, but they might just need extra time or something like that. Sometimes a 504 plan will be for something like a student who is temporarily in a wheelchair to get whatever they need, or a student who has a temporary arm injury to have a scribe or something like that. Any program that receives federal dollars has to abide by Section 504, and it can't discriminate. There's something else I was going to say about 504 plans. I don't remember, so I will move on. ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. This basically extended civil rights legislation to people with all sorts of disabilities. In both cases, these programs are required that schools adopt, but they are not given money to do so by the federal government. Unlike IDEA, the federal government mandates special education and it funds special education. However, it does not fund special education fully. It gives a certain amount of money to states, but it is not enough to fully fund special education. We will talk more in the course about Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Among other things, this means that a student's special needs are private and aren't to be broadcast, basically, for our purposes. In addition to teaching in the regular classroom or the special education classroom, students with special needs may qualify for various related services, including physical therapy, occupational therapy, counseling, sign language interpreting, special transportation, many others. The big thing in your classroom is that you need to be flexible. You need to recognize that at times your students are going to miss class because of these services, or they may be tired in class because of these services that might be intensive, and you need to be flexible with that. In the classroom, I mentioned we would talk about the difference between the Education of All Handicapped Students Act and IDEA. And the big thing of it, I think, was the movement between mainstreaming and inclusion. The idea of mainstreaming is that kids would be in the regular classroom when it sort of just fit. That was usually for non-academic things. It was usually for socialization. Under IDEA, the emphasis switched, and now the idea is that a student is going to be in the regular classroom unless it is proven that they can't be in it for specific reasons, that to meet their needs, here's why they can't be in the classroom for an hour a day while they're receiving math services or reading services or behavioral supports. Some schools use what's called full inclusion, and in full inclusion there basically are no special ed classrooms. All special education services are done in the regular classroom. Both in inclusion and full inclusion environments, you might see a co-teaching model used. In a co-teaching model, a special education teacher or paraeducator in some cases and the classroom teacher will co-teach. When the two are both licensed teachers, in some cases both teachers will be responsible for all students. A special education teacher working in a regular classroom does not have to only work with students who are in special education. They may work with any students. And so in some cases, a teacher, the classroom teacher, may teach a group of students that consists of the students in special education, and the special educator may teach the rest of the class. There are different models that are used. Finally, with inclusion in Minnesota, more students in special ed spend more time in their regular classrooms, which are also called general classrooms, than is true nationally, which is a good thing. Finally, for those of you who are interested, I want to talk about licensure. Although no matter what, you will have students with special needs in your classroom, which is why you're taking this class. Some people want to work exclusively or more with students with special needs, or they want to be even more prepared to help those students in their classrooms. And so Minnesota offers a variety of licensure areas in special education. Traditionally, those areas were categorical. It was by category, like emotional behavior disorders, learning disabilities, physical and health disabilities, autism, blindness, deafness, and so on. More recently, the state has added this academic and behavioral strategist, which enables teachers to work with students from a variety of special needs whose special needs are at the mild or moderate level. So these are the licensure areas offered in Minnesota. As you probably know, BSU offers several of these licenses as part of graduate work. Other colleges offer others. Very few colleges offer all of them because there is limited demand. In other words, very few students qualify for blind or visually impaired services. So those programs are really rare, for example. But you'll see a variety of these at a variety of colleges across the state. Other states, if you want to go teach somewhere else, have somewhat different requirements as well. This does vary from state to state a lot. Some states are like Minnesota was traditionally and have like special licenses for learning disabilities or emotional disorders. Other states only have this sort of academic approach. For example, in Kansas, where I taught, special ed basically had two licenses. There was a high incidence license that covered things like learning disabilities, ADHD, emotional disorders, and there was a low incidence license, which covered things like severe and profound intellectual disabilities, traumatic brain injury, things that were more rare. They also had licenses for blind and deaf students. Finally, speech and language is its own thing. If you want to work with students who have speech-language communication issues, that is done by a speech-language pathologist, which is its own graduate program. Speech-language pathologists are licensed, but they aren't licensed by the Department of Education in states. They're usually licensed by the health department in states. So we've done a lot of work with background this week. I hope you found it useful. If you have questions, thoughts, please let me know. And I will see you next time.